gave you an introduction to this already. Let me kind of further explain here of what 3 factors we look at. One of the factors that we look at, I mentioned, we look at these 3 factors: patient, bug, and the drug, right? That's not new. Okay. So I didn't explain what bug factors we look at, but I have talked about it. So I mentioned that different organisms have different MIC concentrations. In the descriptions that I've given, I'll give you the MIC, which I have on there. But we know, what does this tell us if you have different MIC depending on the type of bug? You may need different concentrations, right? So you need to know what organism we're trying to treat in order to know what concentrations are our target. So it's not like, hey, this drug is going to have a specific concentration. It'll have a specific concentration based on what organism we're trying to go after. Some bugs are resistant. So we know we may need either a different drug or more drug in that particular case. And again, while some drugs may be resistant to multiple drugs, some organisms may be extensively drug resistant, which means that even at higher concentrations of that, at normal concentrations that typically would kill that drug, you may need higher concentrations in order to do it. So the interface between what you'll receive in the lab and what concentrations you'll be shooting for makes sense because there are different factors for the bug. Also different factors in the drug, which we've spent a whole lot of time talking about. So we know that there's different volume distribution, different protein binding. All of that deals with absorption and distribution. Obviously, when we are talking about IV medications, are we worried about absorption? Well, maybe it's not so obvious. No, there's no absorption, right, with IV. But this applies to all oral or IV. So volume distribution, protein binding. We also know that some medications are hydrophilic and some are lipophilic. Does that matter?
Yeah.
What does it matter?
For absorption reasons.
Absorption?
So no?
He said so no. Well, for absorption and distribution, I gave you the where it's going to be. But absorption, yes. But if it's IV, are you worried about absorption? Does this matter for IV medication? Yes. So it's telling you where it would distribute. Will it distribute to fat or not?
Yes.
Will it distribute in, let's say in this particular case, if we're talking about hydrophilicity, will it be highly concentrated in urine or different fluid type of volume that you're looking at? So that matters. Yeah, it does matter with absorption, but it mostly matters with distribution. Things that we look at as far as metabolism, clearance, of course, is very, very important. Of course, elimination, rate constant, and half-life really fall over in elimination. But we know that these factors could be different based on the drug that we're giving, right? Here's the biggest one, though, when you're talking about clinical applications, and that's more the patient factors, because for the most part, the other 2 areas are given. So the bug factors and the drug factors are given. We're going to know they're not going to change necessarily too much per patient, but these are the things that change because patients are different, right? So in critical ill, so I give you 3 different examples of some common patient groups where you may see PK changes. So in critically ill patients, they may have an increased volume of distribution. So when you say, aminoglycosides are 25 to 30%, in a normal, quote unquote, patient, we see that volume distribution will be increased in critically ill patients, so it's probably not 25 to 30%. Critically ill patients typically have a decrease in protein binding. Why? Why do you think?
Because protein is in the urine,
Protein is in the urine? Not supposed to be.
so that's why they're losing protein.
Not supposed to be in the urine. Huh? You could have decreased albumin, right? So those are things that you want to look at. And you can have increased or decreased clearance. Obviously, if there's an increase in volume and distribution, you would expect an increase in clearance. Why would you expect a decrease in clearance? I just told you the increase in volume and distribution. Huh? Kidney dysfunction, that's right. So if you have a corresponding reduction in renal function, what's gonna happen to the clearance? It'll reduce, right? So you can't say, oh, just because I remember you said an increase in volume and distribution, that automatically means increase in clearance, and no, it does not. In obese patients, you may have an increase in volume and distribution. Why? More body. I like that. That's right, more body. Does it matter? I gave you a couple of hints and things that we talked about before, is that, hey, if you have a wide volume of distribution, but this particular drug does not go into fat, will obesity matter in that particular case? There won't be an increase in volume of distribution, because really the increased volume that we're talking about for an obese patient is fat, okay? So, but you expect an increase in volume and distribution for drugs that distribute into the fat. Not necessarily a change in protein binding, assuming that the renal function is normal, that increase in volume and distribution will lead to an increase in clearance. So does this make sense? All right, older patients, this can be a little tricky. There may be an increase or decrease in volume and distribution. There's typically a decrease in protein binding for the same reasons that we talked about before. There's normally a decrease. Actually, when you think of older patients, do you think of increased organ function or decreased organ function? Decrease, right? So you're going to expect decreases in everything. So decreased albumin production obviously will lead to a decreased protein binding, decreased clearance, primarily driven for a decrease in renal function. This increase and decrease in volume and distribution, why is it an increase or a decrease? Why do you think? I'm thinking decrease, but depends on the body mass, right? You expect a decrease in body mass for elderly patients. It may not lead always, depending on how old they are, though. You may have a greater decrease in your rate of elimination. So in younger, older patients, so the way that it kind of works, you probably haven't talked about geriatrics much, but normally you say older adults at 65. Of course, someone 65 to 70 is different from 185, right? So just because they're greater than 65 doesn't mean that you're going to see the same changes. So you may see an increase or decrease in volume of distribution, but you see a decrease in everything else. So these changes, I also put some different disease states. So I mentioned critically ill, but let's say the person is neutropenic. Let's say that they have end-stage renal dysfunction. Pediatric patients typically have variable pharmacokinetics. Burn patients typically have increases in volume of distribution and clearance. So you may see some different things depending on the disease state of the patient. All right, so a lot of what we're talking about is because of these changes in patient factors that we're doing. So if we revisit our first case study from the lab, you ordered 220 milligram IVQ8 using the conventional dosing method, which is what we talked about on Friday. But your preceptor told you, you know, the extended interval dosing method is better for this particular patient. So let's discuss why. When we look at this method, what are the three things that we can change as far as individualizing patient care? Dose and interval, or the time of infusion. So, as we mentioned, with aminoglycosides, we want a high peak level. Right? If we extend the infusion, so I increase the infusion, what will happen to the peak?
It'll be lower.
It'll be lower, right?
Yeah.
We demonstrated that with this particular case in the lab when we looked at a bolus, so giving it all at once versus infusing it over 30 minutes, resulted in a lower peak. So we're not really talking about, this is where some people get confused. We're not talking about the infusion time. So this is not an extended infusion. This is an interval. So we're extending the dosing interval. So what does that mean?
The frequency.
The frequency, which means what? Tell me what the extended part means.
Semen. Oh, no.
Huh? I heard something, but I couldn't make it out what it was. How often you give it, but what does extended mean? Am I giving it more, less? Less. So I'm increasing it from 8 hours to 24 hours or greater, right? So I'm giving what that total daily dose. So we did 220 every 8 hours, and I'm saying I want to give it all at once in a single infusion. So what does that mean? Will the dose be the same, higher, or lower? Huh? 33% chance to get it right. These sound like test questions. Gotta be higher, right? Doing the total daily dose in a single infusion. So it's gonna be a higher dosing strategy that I'm giving less often. Why would I do that? Well, I mean, I'm gonna give you what the studies have shown, but as we mentioned, this is a concentration dependent drug. So if I hit a higher Cmax, it has more killing effect, right? But studies have shown that it's been comparable. That's the word that they'll use. Some may say better because of this elevated peak concentration. But there's also something that's called adaptive resistance. So let me tell you about that a little bit. Microorganisms, once you give antibiotics, these are living organisms, right? So they're coming up with ways to defend themselves, to resist when in the presence of the antibiotic. So the thought is, you give this as a single infusion. So in the first couple of hours, the antibiotics are trying to fight back. They're trying to develop resistance. But for the rest of the time period, it goes back to normal. So if you're giving it multiple times during the day, and then we looked at, how long it's going to take before it goes below the MIC, then in the conventional model, there'll be less time that the bacteria can go back to normal. So there's more resistance potential in the conventional dosing method versus if you just gave it all at once. Because for most of the day, the drug will be below the MIC. So the bacteria is just going back to normal. Well, some of you may be thinking, you may not mention it, but you may be thinking, well, if it's below the MIC, doesn't it mean it's not working? Nope, it still works below the MIC. What do we call that? Everybody quiet, I talked about it a couple of days ago. Y'all slept since then. Look back at your old notes. Huh? Post-antibiotic effect. So aminoglycosides have post-antibiotic effect. So they're still killing even below the MIC. So there's no worries in that particular area. So efficacy, you're not worried about. But there's reduction in toxicity. When you look at the trough levels over 24 hours, it's nearly undetectable. Always going to be 0.0 something. And then there's going to be this drug-free interval that I talked about before. So having that drug-free interval, that time where you're not giving the medication is a safer period. There's decreased monitoring, and I'll talk about that in a second. And there's also decreased cost. So if I give it less often, I don't have to worry about pharmacy costs on that, whether it's making more drug, multiple time technicians delivering it, nurses administering it, lab, because of the decreased monitoring, lab personnel doing draws and samples with that. So when can you not use this particular method? For some of the reasons that I talked about earlier. So for burn patients that have an increase in clearance, we don't want to use that patient for cystic fibrosis. So if the patient is pregnant, for pediatric or neonate, for ascites, why would that be an issue? Like, what is that? Okay. Y'all remember? Y'all talked about that at all?
Fluid in the abdomen.
Fluid, yeah. So third spacing. So now you have increased fluid, extravascular fluid. So that's going to make your kinetics less predictable as well, and hemodialysis patient as well. So we don't use it in those particular cases because of increased clearance and variable PK parameters. So I've talked about it. I've got you all excited. Tell me more about this extended interval. All right. It's again a weight-based approach. With gentamicin and tobramycin, it's going to either be 5 to 7 milligrams per kilo. So, for all of you that are taking notes, let me just make it very clear. There are 2 nomograms that were, it's actually about 3 or 4 nomograms. There are 2 that were the landmark nomograms that were started and are still widely used to this day. The first one here is what we'll call the Hartford, and it's on subsequent slides, so no need to write that down. But the Hartford nomogram, which was the first one in 1995, used 7 milligrams per kilo. So this is going to be the one that we'll use. But the value of the Barnes-Jewish nomogram was Hartford only tested gentamicin and tobramycin. Somebody get a crop there. Barnes-Jewish tested gentamicin, tobramycin, and amikacin. Okay. So what I'm going to show you is kind of a combination, but primarily the distinguished. It's been a long time since 1995 and 1997, right? What we've learned is that for higher MIC microorganisms, we use the 7 milligrams per kilo to achieve our target concentration. For the lower MIC, so for 1 or less, MIC of 1 or less, we can use the 5 milligrams per kilo. So I won't be testing you on that. It's just, hey, when you're going back looking at your notes, when do I use 5 versus 7? Is my organization using 5 or 7? What are we doing? 7 milligrams is the Hartford, 5 milligrams is the Barnes-Jewish, okay? 15 milligrams, again, is the Barnes-Jewish. Hartford didn't have amikacin, and it's used at 15 milligrams per kilo, all right? The other things that we learned was, hey, we can dose. There's a correlation between our KEL and our creatinine clearance. So we don't have to worry about calculating KEL. If they have a creatinine clearance greater than 60, we'll estimate that it's 2 to 4 hours. We can give it every 24 hours. If you have decline in renal function, you have to extend it even further to Q36, Q48. Someone less than 20, let's use the conventional method. Okay? Here's the other thing that I want to highlight. Remember I said decreased monitoring? We don't have to worry about these peaks and troughs that we have to do. You take a random level, 6 to 14 hours post-dose. So you take one level, 6 to 14 hours post-dose, to verify if we need to keep it at Q24, 36, 48, or switch over to conventional. I mentioned it was a nomogram, so not only is it a weight-based approach, once you got that post-dose level, again, 6 to 14 hours post-dose, 6 to 14 hours post-dose, you plot it on this figure here. Whatever that value is. So let's say the value is 8 and it was obtained 8 hours after. We're going to say 8 hours at 8, and it needs to be Q36 because it was in the Q36 range. So even though we initially thought it's supposed to be Q24, now we have what that patient's response to that particular drug is. So it's saying based on if after 8 hours, if it's at an 8, then it's Q36. Do we get it? So this is the gentamicin, tobramycin chart. This is the amikacin chart. So you would do the same thing. What is the concentration? What's the post-dose concentration? And at what time was it obtained? I'll plot that, or whatever it is, and it'll tell me where my interval needs to be.
So, how do we come about the post dose?
What do you mean, how do you come about it?
Like,
How do you come about the C-Max and C-Min?
like
You
this?
ordered it, right?
Okay.
You're just gonna order it. 6 to 14 hours post-dose. Right?
So we use C-Max as our concentration?
Ah, come on now.
So
Come on now, let's not get confused about this. What is C-Max? What is C-Max? C-Max is 30 minutes after the time of your infusion. 6 to 14 hours is not at C-Max or C-Min. That's a random level. That's a random level. So if you want to know, it's CP6, CP10, CP14. Don't get confused on that. Don't get confused on it. C-Max is a very specific time. C-Min is a very specific time. Everything else is a random. That you can identify based on the T. Right? For this particular patient, what will be your initial dose? And dosing interval. We calculated earlier that for this patient we would use the adjusted body weight.
So you gave it to us.
So I gave it to you. That's the same from the lab. Anybody got it yet? All you gotta do, 108.4 times 7. Should be there, real quick. It's gonna be 700 or something. 760?
The dope.
Dose is 760? What's the dose in interval?
So just multiply C-Max and that?
No, he gave you the range, so he said this guy's gonna be 7, so 7 times the body weight, it's 7 milligrams per kilo.
Anybody? This ought to be easy. This shouldn't be anything. Person has good renal function. We can give it every 24 hours. That should have been easy. So 760 every 24. How does this compare? This one will take a little bit more time. So we gave you your estimates here to calculate what that C-Max and that C-Min might be. Right.
So we assume that we just multiply C-Max by the weight?
Remember he gave you the general thing, concentration, and he said that always put 7 in his claims. So 7 milligrams per kilo, so the patient weight is 180 grams per kilo. So you put
did he tell us what driving authority?
What's KEL? Huh? 367? So what's my C-Max?
Yeah, Ryan from class.
Anybody? Anybody have C-Max? No one has C-Max? All right, let's skip it then. All right, what date and time will we order? As we mentioned, the dose will be 6 to 8 hours. Huh?
Do you need any marker?
No, I got plenty of markers. You can't see it?
No.
I'm the front, nothing.
We mentioned that if it's given today, which is the 22nd, 23rd? What's today? 23rd at 9 o'clock. Then 6 hours will be 1,500. Which is 3 p.m. So we can get it as early as 3 p.m. today, or as late as 2300. Or 11 p.m. tonight. Anytime between that time, we'll be able to draw a plasma level. Say what?
I second that.
21 point what? 21.4. And what's C-Min? If it was 3.2, the level that you got, 10 hours after the dose, if it was 3.2, what should you do? So we're talking about tobramycin in this case, the gentamicin or tobramycin. So this is the figure that we would use. We're talking about 3.2, so it's gonna be around here somewhere. And we can, you don't even have to plot it, but you can see that if I'm at 3.2 and I'm anywhere above or less than, let's say, 12 and a half to 13 hours, then Q24 is fine. But if you drew it, that's your 3.2, that's at 10 hours. This is where this point is at, which is in the range of Q24. So we can keep our interval at Q24. So that's how you can do it. Any questions about that? Do we have C-Min?
I got it.
Zero what?
Thank you.
Would you call that detectable?
That's hard.
Huh? Pretty small, right? Pretty small. So how does that compare? Let's go back. This is what you calculated before. How does that compare? Much higher peak, much lower trough, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's exactly what I was talking about before. You're going to have a much higher peak, much lower trough. So it's a better dosing strategy. In patients that can tolerate it. So we talk about the parameters of patients who may not be able to tolerate it, but in patients that you can tolerate it, you'll typically have a peak of greater than 20. So remember we said the higher the peak, the more killing effect. So higher peak greater than 20, you'll have a very low trough level, undetectable, was a word that we use, but very, very low. So if it's being cleared properly, given it 24 hours or more, you should have very low levels. And we calculate that. Remember we looked at one dose, 20 hours out, and it was very low. So without calculating, you should have kind of predicted that it was going to be low, like that. All right, we can do the same approach with vancomycin. So vancomycin has nomograms as well. For this particular one, if we wanted to use, so as I mentioned before, a lot of the nomograms are based on calculations, obviously, but instead of us, calculating them out or using formulas to calculate it, we use weight-based dosing strategy. So vancomycin nomogram is the same. So if we took the second case from the lab and did the same thing with it, there are two. This nomogram has changed over the years. Good thing, we've learned a lot since this nomogram was first created. And this is the most recent version of the nomogram. A couple of things that I want you to do on your own, at home, is I want you to look at the relationships. What happens as however you want to look at it, either as your renal function improves. What I would recommend is that you look at as your renal function declines. So what happens as your renal function declines? So you start here and work your way to the left. What happens as your renal function declines? What happens? Well, what's the relationship between your dose and the patient's weight? What's the relationship between the dose and the patient's weight? What happens as your renal function declines? Also, the third question that I would ask of these next two is, what happens to the regimen, the dose and the frequency based on your target? So here is the lower target, the 10 to 15. As I mentioned a couple classes ago, vancomycin, our trough is normally from 10 to 20. So you normally are gonna have 10 to 15 for lower MIC microorganisms. For higher MIC microorganisms, we're looking at 15 to 20. So this is the 10 to 15 nomogram. All you would do for this particular patient, as we said, our desired is supposed to be 10 to 15. So it should be 10 to 15 on there. So we're looking at the lower dose. We already see that they have a 64.4 creatinine clearance, and they are 103 pounds. So we're here, 103 pounds. We said 60. So here's what our dose and dosing interval should be: 1,000 milligrams every 24 hours. Yeah.
So I know where I work, vancomycin dosing is a big thing for.
Yeah, huge thing.
Is this what they use to do vancomycin dosing?
You would have to tell me. So there's, I would have to see what they're doing. In most cases, they are using a nomogram.
Okay.
Most cases, yes.
Okay.
Yes. But I would have to see what they're doing.
Because we, like, it's very hard for them to do it. So if this is what they're working on.
Oh, wait a minute, hold on one second. So, here's my hesitation. When you say hard, it starts to make me think about something. All right, so this came out in the 90s. So both of these nomograms came out in the 90s, and this is what we've been using for a long time. But one of the things that I want to show you, and this is a good time to kind of talk about this, they only went up to 109 kilograms. Do we have patients greater than that? So we don't know what to do. There's variability, we talked about that. And they only went to, 110 kilograms, and they only went up to, which is fine. We round after this, but they only went to 40 milliliters per minute for your creatinine clearance. So what do we do in patients who have reduced renal function, below 40, and weight greater than 110? So what I will tell you, and I've had this argument with many pharmacists, actually with pharmacy students too, because most pharmacy students say, man, you come in there, we tune you out. That's fine. Then you get to your rotation site and say, uh-oh. And some people say, well, you know what, that's why I'm working retail anyway. Okay, fine. You gotta pass the board first. You gotta pass your rotation first. So good luck. And so from the 90s up until now, everyone's like, these little calculations, man, I'll just read this piece of paper. Guidelines came out just last year that said, you know what, this piece of paper may be good for most people, but it's hurting people as well. Okay? So we need to go back to the calculations. So what they may be using is a tool, which we don't have here, but we'll do some simulations of it in our lab session. But they may be using a calculator in order to do it. That's built in. I think they're using Epic at Harris Health, right? So they have a calculator, which is an add-on called, I think it's called Metadose or something like that. That's an add-on that most hospitals in the medical center are using, which I've seen that it actually allows you to use these calculations for most drugs, which has opened up pharmacokinetic dosing. When they do that, they have all of these formulas plugged in. So they're getting this information, they're getting levels to get individualized kinetics so that we can make dosing adjustments. So it is a game changer, but what people might be struggling with is when they had a mentality of, I'm not gonna pay attention to this in school, and they're trying to figure out what's going on to this computer and they don't know. But the relationships are there. As I mentioned, take a look at the weight, see what it does. Weight-based dosing. You'll see what range it's doing. Take a look at what's happening with the creatinine clearance. I already told you there's a linear relationship between the creatinine clearance and the KEL. You'll see what it's doing. So before you even plug it into the calculator, you need to know what's probably gonna happen. You know, if it didn't come up with what you think was gonna happen, then something must have went wrong in there. So you may never have to pull out this formula again. You know, well, you'll have to pull it out, but you don't have to memorize it necessarily. But you may have it on a sheet of paper, because when I need to make some adjustments or figure out, man, what's going on here, that formula is tried and true. It'll tell me. So I'm going to suspect, what I've known, that they're not having problems with this. What they're having problems with is transitioning this, if this is what they knew, to using a dose calculator. Yeah. All right, so this is the 10 to 15. This is the one we'll use, but as I mentioned, there's a 15 to 20. So I think in your homework assignment, it was a 15 to 20. So you can use either, not either one for your homework assignment, you would use this. For the case that we talked about, you'll use the one before. But take a look at what happens when you're doing a higher target versus a lower target. What's your dosing strategy? What's your intervals? How do they differ? Do you have to memorize every block? No, I said, what's the pattern? What's going on?
So, Dr. Piper?
Yes.
So if the person weighs less than 50, how do we go about that? I'm confused.
Why are you asking that question? Are you saying on a test or you
No.
want to know in real life?
right here in the case, I'm just trying to correlate it with this.
The person weighs less than 50.
Kilograms. So I just want to know how to approach that, according to that graph.
Was this patient 46 kilograms in the case?
Yeah, it says that.
Kilograms, yeah. This should be kilograms, not pounds.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a type. I was about to say this should be kilograms, not pounds. So that must be a typo. But yeah, the patient wasn't 46 kilograms in our case that we did. It's just the exact same case that we did in lab. So
No, I thought you were probably trying to show a different.
nah, I was not. I was not at all. But very straightforward, very simple.
Mm-hmm. No, that's.
Pick one, see what happens. Okay. So here are the things, and you might be thinking this based on what I said earlier about Aaron's question. Well, why are they using this calculator? Well, the reality is we've always known. So for the last 7 years, I've been talking about this in this class and trying to show a relationship of AUC, because that's really what the gold standard is. But no one was calculating AUC until now. So before it's like, talking about forms, they said we only using troughs. I said, yeah, this is why I showed you how to use troughs. But really, this is what's clinically significant. So, as I mentioned, new guidelines came out last year to say everyone needs to figure out how they're going to calculate AUC to make sure. Because as I said, people were getting hurt. So, remember this. Remember, you want an AUC to MIC ratio of 400 to 600 for vancomycin. We still monitor troughs. Everyone's not to AUC. And there are some cases, I'm not going to get into the specifics, I just want you to kind of understand the difference. But there are some cases where continuing to monitor troughs might be better instead of worrying about AUC to MIC calculation. But for our purposes, there are also, forgot to mention this, I've been giving you the time of the infusion, but really in the real world, you'll have guidelines as to what vancomycin infusion to use. Does anyone know what? No one? I heard something. It was real low though. There are what's called rate-related vancomycin reactions. So if you give vancomycin too quickly, you may anticipate certain side effects that are not really associated with efficacy or anything like that, or a plasma level. It's just the infusion rate. So in most hospitals, or any hospital that I've ever seen, they're going to have some kind of infusion guidelines. This is just a common one that you'll see, but it might be different. So this is just an example. Might be the same, but it might be different. But this is the most common one that's used. So in our particular case, what did we say that we were using for this patient? They were down here. So 1500 Q12. So if they're 1500 Q12, then we're talking about a 90-minute infusion. So if we did that, we should be able to calculate what their, this should say C-min. I asked for trough, so that should say C-min, but that is the C-min equation.
Okay.
So you should be able to calculate what that trough should be. And then this is only for illustration purposes. What I mean by that is there are different ways to calculate area under the curve. If you're using some fancy software, they have a different formula that they use. But for our purposes, we've been using AUC as the dose over the clearance. So we'll continue to do that just for illustration purposes. But remember, that clearance is an estimate. So if I have plasma levels, then I can really tell what the clearance is for that particular one. So the relationship is still the same when we're using the dose, but we're not using the estimated clearance in those calculators. We're actually using two different random levels. They don't have to be a Cmax or Cmin. They can be two random levels that we can do to estimate the clearance. But for now, we'll just use what we have. And we'll assume that MIC is 1. So we'll be able to do that. And what this is, so I just wanna, we don't have to go over the answer now, we can go over it later, but this is how you illustrate if it's the right, well, I saw it on the nomogram, it said 1500 Q12, are we done? What is 1500 Q12 gonna get us as far as the trough level, and is that in our AUC to MIC ratio? That's telling you if we're done. So if this number is between 400 and 600, it's a good regimen. If this C-min is within our goal, then it's a good regimen. If it's not, then we need to make an adjustment. So anyone have the C-min? Not yet?
No, sir.
Dr. Capers.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand, how'd you get 1500?
How'd you get what?
1500.
What was her weight?
103 kilograms.
So she would be down here. What was the creatinine clearance?
64.
64? So
Yeah.
it should be here then.
Yeah, I was just understanding why you.
That's how much I got. They told me 1500 Q12.
Mm-mm.
So it's here.
Yes, sir.
So 1750 Q18.
Yes, sir. Yeah, because you have to use the one that's instead of 15, and then you look at it. It was 1750. So
I didn't write down enough of my information
I'm
here.
about to say, what's time infusion?
Well, the time of infusion is easy.
How
You
is
said
that
it's
on that
1750.
So it's 120 minutes.
So it's 120 minutes.
Oh, so you
But I
got
didn't
the
write
match
down
on.
the volume distribution and all of that from the earlier case. And I didn't bring it with me either.
I thought if we had
Well, we should have it in the earlier, in the homework slides. Anyone have it? We in case 2.
no, we're trying to see which
Homework.
okay.
Homework. The lab. That's probably in the first lecture. Look at it at home.
You talking about this one, the first one, the one you did on Friday?
Nah, the from one last Friday.
No, that's
From
yeah,
last
that's
week.
right.
The first one, give me the first.
This one, that's today.
Not today, but the first one.
The first one is this, set on.
.98.
This one, the volume, and
KL, give me the volume distribution of KL.
the volume distribution is 0.98 liters per kilogram.
.98. And what was the weight? What weight?
Per weight,
Yeah, you had the 103 kg.
103 kg.
What's KL?
KL is 0.0352.
0352.
0.0352.
Yeah.
Okay.
That should give it to us.
Okay.
So what do we have?
Let me just go ahead and calculate this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You got it?
No, she said, volume distribution liters per kilogram, so I'm not
Is it
sure.
times 2 or minus 2?
Hmm?
Is that
Yeah,
times
liters
2?
per kilogram.
Difference.
Mm-hmm. Time. Oh, minus 2 at the end. That's elimination.
Okay, good.
No numbers yet?
Yeah. You know what's wrong? You gotta do it piece by piece,
Yeah, my hand.
or else you'll get it wrong.
Oh yeah, I suggest piece by piece. Oh, how much? So are we good? Are we good with the AUC? You don't know?
400 to 600, I believe. That's okay.
.79, did y'all need that for this evening? I could've did it wrong.
You said what? 18.9?
79,
18.7?
that's what I got, but I did it bad.
Anyone got anything in it, different? 18.79, you said?
Yes.
So let's just call it 18.8. What was our goal? Hey, we're almost done.
I
Come
didn't
on
get
in.
that, but you
You
get
can come in now. What was our goal?
You didn't do it.
Um,
Leslie, did you do it? I didn't get that in.
You got something different?
I did too.
When?
I got 11.55.
You got what?
11.55.
You got 11?
I got it.
Huh?
to.
You got 14? Oh,
11.55.
I got 20.
How you get 11.55?
Bottom line is, what was our goal?
10 or 15?
10 to 15. With the exception of JD, who was just playing now.
I got 11.55. I'm ready to go.
Everybody else is giving me something that's outside of the range, right? But the AUC is within the range.
So that means it's supposed to be within the.
So one of the this is one of the reasons. Well, this is just a calculation, but you know, we'll get a real. This is one of the reasons why the trop level can actually fool you.
I got 10.07. I got 10.7 when I did it again.
How you get from 18 to 10?
I don't know.
Man, I don't know what you plugging in. I may need to. Let me take this off.
What you get for C-Max?
I don't know.
I didn't write nothing down.
Oh, see,
Yeah,
that's the
I
problem.
don't know exactly what it sound
You
like.
gotta break it into pieces.
Crazy number. I don't know.
You gotta break it into
You
pieces.
erased that.
Oh yeah, I don't trust what you give me. But nobody else is giving me anything else, so I don't know. So anyway, that's what we compare. We'll see if the trop is in our range, if the AUC, MIC is in the range. So that's how we'll know. If it's
So
right.
golden rule, if the AUC is in the range, the trop should be in the range.
Nah, not necessarily.
No?
The weight is in kilograms.
I didn't get
Okay,
to.
I'll keep my 18.
Now you going back to 18? I don't know what to say.
What you gonna get for C-Max?
I don't know what to say.
No one else is talking.
They keep it quiet. But the AUC, the trough and the AUC ratio are not always the same. One can be in range and the other one is not, which is essentially the argument of just going with AUC strategies and not really worried about if the trough is too high or too low. Because really, nephrotoxicity has been more associated with an AUC greater than 600 than it has been with the trough greater than 20.
I got 11.55.
All right. Yeah, 1155?
I got 11.55.
So that sounds like